Test, test. Is it on? Okay. Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. We're not going to cover a whole lot tonight, so there's a possibility we'll get out early. But I think we left off, honestly, I don't remember. We'll just start around verse 22 of chapter 5. I can't remember if we covered these verses or not, but it's probably a decent place to pick back up anyway. So in chapter 5, what we're reading about, a guy named Belshazzar has become king of Babylon. He's reigning as a co-regent with his father, who's Nabonidus. And the events that we're looking at in chapter 5, this is the last night of the Babylonian Empire. What has happened, and I didn't tell you guys some of this last week. So the day for this, or the evening for chapter 5, it's October the 11th of 539. But if you back up one day, October the 10th, Nabonidus, who is the father of Belshazzar, he loses a battle to the Medes and Persians at a place called Sippar. And as he loses the battle, he ends up fleeing to another location, but the Medes and Persians capture him there. And he ends up getting deported back to another city in Persia or Media. And so at this point, he's lost a battle and he's off the scene. So now Belshazzar is the only one ruling. And what has happened is the Medes and Persians have taken all of Babylon except for the capital city that Belshazzar and the other people are living inside at this time. And so, but the capital city of Babylon is, they think, very well secure, that they have enough supplies to survive a long siege of several years even, if they needed to. And so they're feeling pretty secure inside the city, and so Belshazzar throws this party on the evening of October 11th, and which is what we're reading about here in this chapter. And I'll give you a little more details about what happens on the evening after we finish the chapter, because the chapter doesn't tell you the whole story about historically what happens. So as we're reading the chapter, he starts off throwing the party. He's leading the drinking. He's probably starting to get drunk. And so he asks for the emblems from at least Judah, if not some of the other places they have taken over, to be brought to the party so that they can drink from them, which is a huge no-no. You didn't do that. You didn't desecrate sacred objects, even sacred objects from other countries. They were still viewed as sacred objects, and so you did not desecrate them, but he does it anyway. And as a result, God ends up writing on the wall with a hand. So you see this hand show up. He's writing on the wall. And so as this happens, Belshazzar realizes this is, well, first, he sobers up real fast once he sees that. But two, he realizes he's made a huge mistake. Because one, you don't desecrate sacred objects. Two, you don't insult a deity. He's done both. And so now what he realizes is Yahweh is not dead. Yahweh is not defeated. In fact, Yahweh is sending him a direct message. And so he panics and he calls for his guys and his administration who can interpret these kind of things. But they can't interpret it. So then the Queen Mother comes on the scene, and she's either, we talked about this last week, she's either she's probably his grandmother, most likely it's his grandmother, instead of his actual, it could be his mother, I suppose. Well, yeah, it could be his mom or his grandmother, depending on some things we talked about last week. Anyway, she wasn't invited to the party for obvious reasons, but once all this happens, she ends up coming into the banquet hall And I'm sure she's probably thinking to herself, what a disaster when she walks in, seeing everything that's going on. Probably thought to herself, how could you be so stupid to take these emblems out of the temple and desecrate them, along with all the other nonsense she probably saw going on. But as she walks in, she says, "O King, live forever," which is kind of a typical greeting, although it makes you wonder if she really believed that based on what she probably saw when she walked in. And she tells him, hey, there's this guy Daniel, she calls him your father. When your father Nebuchadnezzar was king, Daniel interpreted a lot of similar things like this. And we talked last week about how Nebuchadnezzar might actually be his legitimate biologic father, could be his grandfather. It could be either one. And so he ends up calling Daniel in, and so that's where we kind of left off last week. So Daniel ends up starting to talk to him. He basically recounts the things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar by Yahweh, with the implication, if Nebuchadnezzar is a lot better king and a lot stronger king than you, and Yahweh did these things to him, you're not much of a king, and you did far worse things to Yahweh. So what do you think Yahweh's going to do to you? And that's kind of where we left off last week. And the other thing Daniel points out to Belshazzar is he reminds him, hey, you were alive and you were living in the city when Nebuchadnezzar got humiliated by God. God put a delusion on him, made him act like an ox or some kind of animal for about 7 years. He could not rule during that time. You were living in the city. You saw this happen. The person that's called his father, Nabonidus, was actually an administrator in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, so he saw it firsthand. And he's reminding him, you were there, you saw it, you know this happened, and yet you turned around and did these things tonight. And basically the implication is, how could you be so foolish? And that's where we left off. So we'll pick up with verse 22. And it says, but you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. Okay, so again, he saw this happen with Nebuchadnezzar. And as Daniel already reminded him in that section, the things that happened with Nebuchadnezzar were all a result of Nebuchadnezzar's pride. If he had not been so prideful, these things would not have happened to him. And consequently, if Belshazzar had not been so prideful, what's about to happen to him would not happen either. So verse 23, it says, and you lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you. You and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. So what he's saying is, you brought these sacred items that used to be in the temple in Judah, in Jerusalem, that Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple, brought back to Babylon. But when he brought them back to Babylon, he just stuck them in a temple there in Babylon. And so they weren't touched, they weren't bothered, they weren't desecrated. But Belshazzar took them out and desecrated them tonight. And so what he's saying is Nebuchadnezzar didn't even make that kind of stupid mistake, but you did. And so in the process of desecrating these objects that are devoted to Yahweh, you're also worshiping these other gods, these gods of Babylon, and he calls them the gods of silver, gold, bronze, and iron, wood and stone. But he says you're worshiping them, but the problem is your gods, they don't see, and they don't hear, and they don't know. And it's because they're not real. And so you did desecrate and insult the one true God in the process of trying to worship your gods that aren't even real. And just like your gods that Nebuchadnezzar used to worship didn't save him from Yahweh, these gods that you're worshiping aren't going to save you from Yahweh, okay? And it says, then he goes on and says, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. So he he tells Belshazzar, your very life is held in God's hand, and he can do whatever he wants with it. And you insulted the one person that controls everything, the one person that controls your life, your very breath, and whether or not you're going to see another day. You insulted him of all people. So verse 24, it says, then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. So he reminds him, or he points out that the writing that was on the wall that you saw, that is a message from Yahweh. All right, so verse 25 says this, and the inscription, and this is the inscription that was written. So there's 4 words here, and depending on what translation you're looking at, the last word's going to look a little different, and I'll try to explain that in a second. So these are 4 Aramaic terms. Well, it's really 3. One of them's repeated twice. So it's Mene, Tekel. And then if you're looking at the New King James, it's Upharsin. But if you're looking at, like, say, the ESV, it's going to have Parsin instead of Upharsin. There's a reason for that, and you probably don't really care, but I'll tell you anyway. So if you're looking at the New King James, that 4th word, the Upharsin, the U on the front is actually the word and. So in Hebrew and Aramaic, the word and basically looks like and functions like a prefix. So you just stick it on the front of the word. And so what the New King James is doing is it's literally translating the whole word, when it could have just dropped that U off the front and put the English word and then put the Aramaic word out there. And so that's why it looks different than it may look in other translations. So the U is just the word and on the front of that. And then there's a difference in spelling from some translations to the others. So that last word, you might have a PH. So in New King James, it says UPH. Other translations, it just says P instead of PH. The reason for that, it's the same letter in Hebrew and Aramaic, but sometimes that letter is pronounced like a P, like our word P, like for person or whatever. And sometimes it's pronounced like a PH, like in the word Pharaoh. But it's a single letter in that those languages. You just have to know, for a given word, should it be pronounced like a P or a F? And that's why some of the translations are spelled differently. Anyway, like I said, it's probably more than you want to know. Okay, so it's going to tell you directly what these words mean. Now, in the next few verses here, when it breaks this down. So the issue here, why could these guys not read this? Because the Babylonian guys that Belshazzar calls in initially, it says they couldn't read it. It's not that they couldn't read it, most likely. Either they here's the issue. In Aramaic and Hebrew, there are no vowels, at least back then. The vowels weren't added to a Hebrew text until about the 9th century AD, okay, so long after Jesus, about a little over 1,000 years ago. So why did Jews go back in and add vowels about 1,000 years ago? It's because they were afraid people would forget how to pronounce stuff, so they made up these little symbols for different vowels, and they went back in and stuck all these vowels in there so people would know how to pronounce the words, okay, because they were afraid that people might forget how to pronounce it over time. And so that's why they did that. But if you go back to the original, there are no vowels. So, and the other issue is the words were probably all stuck together without spaces in between the words. So then it becomes difficult to know, like, where does one word stop and one start, and which vowels should you stick in there. So maybe they couldn't really read it because they were having a hard time figuring out what word is this. Or it may be that they could read it, but they weren't sure what the meaning of it was. Okay, so I'll give you an example. See if you can figure out what these words are. I won't even tell you how many words there are. I'll just give you a string of letters, and you see if you can figure out what it is. Okay, so SWMBKRN. SWMBKRN. You can think about it for a minute. If you can figure, there's probably a few people in here that immediately know what that is, but if not, you can ponder it for a minute. Okay, so as you're looking at these words, just imagine dropping the vowels out. So you would have MN, MN, TKL, and then forget the U on the front. A P or PH, it's really just a P, then RSN, okay? And so as you're looking at that, especially if it's all stuck together, you're probably like, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what this is. So let's go through and see what these words mean. So the first word is mene, so he repeats it twice. If you have a footnote, so these three words, they have literal meanings, but they also represent weights that they used to use for weighing things to decipher how much something would cost. So it was part of a weights and scales thing. So the word mene, it literally means a mina, so it's the equivalent of 50 shekels. But the word itself, as you look at verse 26, it says this is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. So the word mene actually means numbered, is what it means. And so what God is saying by using that word and actually using it twice is that the days of the king's life has been numbered. In other words, you're running out of time. So that's what that means, and it's repeated twice. And so the second word then, verse 27, is takel, and it means you have been weighed. So the word is literally weighed. So the first word is numbered, weighed. And the word tekel, it literally it means a shekel. So you're going from from 50 shekels down to 1 shekel as you look at the weights. So you're going 50 shekel, 1 shekel. And then the last word, let me finish verse 27. So tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. In other words, you, the king, your life has been put on the scales of life, and you're coming up a wee bit short because you're a terrible human being. And so more than a wee bit short. So that's why God is going to eliminate you rather quickly. And then verse 28, and if you notice here, depending on what translation you got, actually all of them do this. So when it's talking about the writing on the wall, it says upharsin, but when you get down here, when he's actually explaining what the words mean, he goes with the word peres. It's the same word, and I know it looks different, but if you look at upharsin, drop the U off, ignore it for a second. Pretend the PH is a single letter, because in reality it is. It's just a P. And then forget the I end on the N. And what you'll notice is you have the letters P, R, S, okay? And if you drop down to verse 28, what you still have are the letters P, R, S. It's the same word, so what's the difference in the two words? The upharsin is the plural, whereas the peres is the singular of the same word. It's the only thing that's going on there. So the I-N on the end of upharsin makes it a plural version of that word. Okay, so what does upharsin mean? It literally means a half shekel. So in terms of weights, so in terms of weights, you're going 50 shekel, 50 shekel, shekel, half shekel. But in terms of meaning, you're going numbered, weighed, and then the last word is verse 28. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So it's a message to convey the fact that the king, basically, if you interpret it, it means you're about to die. That's what it really means. It means you are a terrible human being, and God is going to give your kingdom to somebody else. That's really what it means. So, did anybody figure out the little words I said? No takers? All right, I'll say it one more time. SWMBKRN. KRN. SWMBKRN. A lot of struggles, it looks like. Okay. Swim, bike, run. It's a triathlon. Okay. Swim, bike, run. All right, so that's basically the same idea as what's happening here. So you can see how it's hard if you take the vowels out and you smush it all together. You're like, this should be easy. It's 3 4-letter words, but I can't figure it out. So it's the same idea as what you're looking at here. All right, so verse 29, it says, Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So it doesn't say that Belshazzar repented, but it does indicate that he believes the message is true. And how do you know that? Because he keeps his promise that he said he would do for anybody that interpreted the message on the wall. So he believes the message has been interpreted and interpreted properly. So he does go ahead and give Daniel the third position in the kingdom, and then the robe and the necklace. You might ask, well, why does Daniel accept this? He already told him he doesn't want his trinkets. And the reason is two, really. One, it's not going to change the outcome at this point, so why make a scene? Who really cares? Daniel doesn't really care. And the other reason is, Daniel knows this is going to be totally meaningless in less than 12 hours. The fact that he's third in the kingdom right now is literally not going to mean anything in the morning once the king is dead. So why make a scene by, refusing the gifts and all that? It's all meaningless anyway. So Belshazzar, like I said, it does not say he repented, so there's no indication that he did. But he does accept that the meaning is true, and he does go ahead and give Daniel the rewards that he promised. All right, so verse 30, it says, That very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. All right, so let me kind of tell you the rest of the story that the Bible doesn't specifically mention here, and it doesn't really need to mention this. So like I mentioned earlier, on the 10th, so October 10th, 539, Nabonidus, the father, he loses a battle to the Medes and Persians, and he tries to flee, but he ends up getting captured, and so they deport him. All right, so that's on the 10th. On the 11th, which is the next day, is the day that this banquet happens, okay? Then, so we're sometime in the night of the banquets, either late on the 11th or early on the morning of the 12th, when these things are happening with Daniel talking to Belshazzar. So on the morning of the 12th, the Medes and Persians come into the city, or actually they come in overnight. So what ended up happening, and why did they come into the city? Well, a couple things. The people didn't actually like Belshazzar or Nabonidus. So they didn't like Nabonidus for a multitude of reasons. One, he didn't worship their gods. He worshiped the moon god Sin. So they didn't like him for that reason, but they also didn't like him because he worshiped the moon god Sin. He spent most of the time away from the city and didn't really function as the king. And so they despised him for that because he really wasn't there very often. So they didn't really like him, but they hated Belshazzar because Belshazzar was just a horrible person, okay? So when the Medes and Persians come into the city, people don't care. They don't even offer any resistance. They probably pointed to where Belshazzar was. Yeah, he's down the street. So they didn't care. They didn't fight against them. So how did they get into the city? Well, remember, the city had multiple walls, and the Babylonians thought it was pretty impregnable. But the problem was the river ran through the city, and so obviously the river ran under the wall. So this would be the Euphrates River, I think. And so what the Babylonians did is they just diverted the river, and so then they could just walk on the riverbed right under the wall and into the city. So the army just marched right under the wall and got into the city. And then, so what happens is, a long time before this, there was Belshazzar. Well, let me back up and tell you another few things about Belshazzar and why the people hated him. So Belshazzar, prior to his dad becoming the king, there was another guy that was king who was in the line of Nebuchadnezzar. And he got assassinated. And Belshazzar was one of the ones that led the assassination. And as a result of him being assassinated, he made some money off that. And so once he assassinated that king, he proposed that his father Nabonidus become king, which you might think on the surface sounds good, but he really did it because he didn't think Nabonidus was going to live very long. So then he would just become king after that anyway. So it kind of made him look good that he didn't immediately kill the king and then become the new king. But the people knew that he did it, and they didn't like him for that. And another thing he did, so once he also, there was a guy in the administration who was one of the governors, and he went on a hunting trip with that guy's son. And I guess that guy's son ended up somehow, maybe, I don't know if they got in an argument or he did better or whatever. But anyway, Belshazzar got mad and he kills him, okay? He kills the son. Well, the father, that guy, his name was Gobrias, and Gobrias was a governor in Babylon. Well, when Belshazzar kills his son, he gets very upset and he leaves and he defects to the Medes and the Persians. And so what ends up happening is he becomes the leader of the military that then invades Babylon, okay? So he knows his way around the city when he walks in. He used to live there. And so he goes straight to the palace, leads the troops straight to the palace. He finds Belshazzar in the palace with a dagger about to commit suicide. He stops him from committing suicide and then turns around and kills him that morning, okay? So he gets revenge for his son's death by killing Belshazzar, okay? And so that's sort of some poetic justice, I guess you could say, as a result of the story. And so that's how Babylon falls. Now, the other thing to point out here in this last verse of chapter 5, it says, Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And there's some problems with that because there isn't really a guy in history called Darius the Mede. So who is this? Why is this not a historical figure that we know of? Well, he's one of two people. He might be the guy I just told you about that led the troops into the city, and he killed Belshazzar, and then he stayed and kind of ruled over the city under for the Medes and Persians. That's one possibility. But the more likely possibility is this is actually Cyrus, okay, who is the king of the Medes and Persians. So Cyrus actually entered the city about 2 weeks later. So Belshazzar gets killed on the morning of the 12th. Cyrus arrives on the 29th, so 17 days later. So why would the Bible call him Darius the Mede and not Cyrus? Well, in the book of Daniel, there is going to be Cyrus the Persian mentioned later. And so what may be happening is he may actually have two throne names. So if you remember back when we talked about Tiglath-Pileser III in Assyria, his Assyrian throne name is Tiglath-Pileser III, but his Babylonian throne name, which also appears in the Bible, is Pul, P-U-L. And so in the Bible, Tiglath-Pileser III shows up as two different guys. There's Tiglath-Pileser III and there's Pul. And if you don't know that they're the same guy, then you get confused, okay? So he has two different names depending about if you're talking about his Assyrian throne name or his Babylonian throne name. And that may be the same thing here, is that Cyrus's Persian throne name might be Cyrus, and his Median throne name might be Darius, okay? One of his parents is actually Median, and his other parent is Persian. Let me just check. Okay, his mother is Median, his father is Persian, okay? And that might be why he has two names. And so, you know, sometimes people want to say, oh, the Bible's wrong about this or that, and therefore you can't trust any of it. And this is one of those cases because they'll say, oh, it talks about this Darius the Mede guy, and this isn't even a historical person. Probably it's Cyrus, just that he has two different names. Okay, that's the easiest explanation. And if you notice, if you flip to the end of chapter 6, very last verse of chapter 6, it's going to say, so this Daniel proposed in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian, okay? So we got a guy called Darius the Mede, and we got a guy called Cyrus the Persian. Presumably they're the same person, okay? If you look at it that way, it eliminates all the confusion. Because in this last verse of chapter 5, it says that Darius is 62 years old, and we know from history that that is about the correct age that Cyrus would have been when this happened, okay? So it's probably one and the same person. All right, so that's the end of chapter 5. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, we'll cover just the very first paragraph of chapter 6 real quick, and then we'll do the rest of it next week. All right, so in chapter 5, Daniel, we don't really think about it, but he appears in multiple chapters, but his age is drastically different depending on what chapter you're looking at. So early on in the book, he's a teenager, then he's around 20, and then you fast forward and he's like 50. Then in chapter 5, he's about 80, and then chapter 6, this would be shortly thereafter, after chapter 5, so he's going to be 80-ish or early to mid-80s, somewhere in there. So he's an older man at this point. All right, so verse 6, it says, it pleased Darius, again, probably Cyrus, pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. Now, we actually know from history that the Medes and Persians usually would only have about 20-ish satraps. So, and that's another thing some people question, why is there 120? Because they never had that many. It might be including some lower level administrative people in that number, and so that may be why it says 120. All right, so it says appointed 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one. So Daniel, just like he was in Babylon, remember Nebuchadnezzar made him pretty much second in charge. Belshazzar just made him third in charge, although that didn't really mean anything. But now he's functioning under the Medes and the Persians, and under in their kingdom, he is going to be one of the top 3 governors, okay? So he's going to be very high up in their government as well. It says, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them so that the king would suffer no loss. So what does that mean? All that means is the role for these 3 guys is to make sure the guys under them don't steal money from the government, okay? So the other guys are supposed to collect the taxes from the people and then honestly give the full amount to the government. As you can imagine, there would be a lot of temptation to steal money from the tax money. And so the role for these three, Daniel and these other two guys, is to make sure these guys aren't skimming money off the top. That's their main job. All right, so verse 3, it says, "Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him." What does that mean exactly? You can interpret it different ways. Does it just mean he had outstanding character? Or does it mean something more spiritual, that the Holy Spirit was working through him in some kind of way that was obvious to everybody? I don't know which one it is. But anyway, because of an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So you've got this situation where you got all these satraps that collect the taxes, and then they report to Daniel and these two other guys. But Daniel is clearly so much better than these other two that Darius, a.k.a. probably Cyrus, is contemplating, why don't I just make Daniel over all these guys? And basically Daniel would then just be second only behind Darius himself, okay? So verse 4, it says, "So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him." So obviously Daniel is very, very good at what he does, but he's also a high moral and person and a high character person. So they can't find anything wrong with him. He's not stealing money like maybe they were. He's not doing anything against the government. He doesn't do anything bad to anybody. And so he's a very upstanding moral person. And so they're wanting to catch him on something. Now remember, the same thing happened to him in the Babylonian administration, right? They didn't like him either. They got jealous, and so they caught him praying and tried to get him on that. And now you're going to have a similar situation in the Medes and Persians, where the other rulers get jealous of him because he's so much higher character than they are. So verse 5, it says, "Then these men said, 'We shall not find any charge against this Daniel, unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God.'" All right, so two things to notice. One, notice they're not calling him by his Babylonian name. Whether or not he chose to go by Daniel or they're calling him Daniel, I don't know. But anyway, they're not calling him Belteshazzar. That's one. But two, the very interesting thing is they admit that they can't find anything wrong with this guy, which says multiple things. One, it says a lot about Daniel. It also says a lot about them, okay? Because they're kind of implying, gee, we should be able to find something on everybody. Like, if somebody tried to find something on us, it wouldn't be that hard. They could probably find lots of things on us. But we can't find anything wrong that this guy's doing. So the only way we're going to be able to figure out something is to make up something about his God, because obviously he's faithful to his God. And so we'll stop there tonight, but just as we kind of go through the week, that's something we should all strive for, that people would say about us, is, gee, we just can't find anything wrong with that guy. If we were to find something wrong with him, we would have to make up something false about something he does with his religion. And so, that's something we should all kind of strive for, that people would view us that way as well. Anybody have any thoughts or questions for tonight? Okay, well, we'll stop there because I know the bell's going to ring, and we'll pick up there next week. Good to see everybody.